Antony Davies, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thanks for having me.
So I have been following your writings for a long time. You're an economist, you know statistics, you know finance, and you are an extreme rational optimist. You
Yes.
and so I thought what I would do today with you is play the other side.
Hmm.
The side that says, I don't believe you that the graph is going up and to the right, or that I think that there's an incomplete story there, and there's a lot of brokenness, and the world seems like it's getting worse in a lot of dimensions, and let's take it from there. So, first, make the case, in a broad way, that the world is even getting better at all.
Yeah. Well, let me start off by underlining that the world is not getting better across the board. If you pick around, you can certainly find ways in which the world's getting worse. But generally speaking, the trend is very clearly positive. Give you a few examples. In the 1800s, early 1800s, roughly 95% of the world lived in what today we call extreme poverty. And this was a big problem, not just because 95% of people were in extreme poverty, but the world population for the first time was starting to grow exponentially. And economists at the time looked at that and said, oh my God, it's going to be a decade, and all of a sudden there's going to be mass starvation.
This is
Never
Thomas
happened.
Malthus.
Yeah, Thomas Malthus, exactly. Never happened. In fact, what happened is the population grew even faster than Malthus feared, but the world poverty rate dropped to the point that as of, I think, 5 years ago, we dropped below 10%. For the first time in the history of Homo sapiens, fewer than 10% of the humans on the planet were living in extreme poverty. It just continues to go in that direction, despite the fact there's now 8 billion of us. So that's one big thing we could point to. You can point in the United States to a massive increase in the standard of living. And it happens generationally, so people tend not to be aware of it. But you go back a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and life is very different to the extent that today, what we call poverty wage, let's say 720, forget about $10 an hour, let's say 725 an hour, full-time worker. Clearly, today we call that poverty, no question, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about that. What I am saying is we should look at where we've come. That standard of living is actually better than the standard of living that the median American had 100 years ago.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation.
Why should I care about the differences between 100 years ago and today as someone that's living in the world now and that is trying to make personal choices and political choices um, on the basis of the challenges I'm facing, the challenges of things like what seems to be a very clear rising cost of housing, rising cost of seemingly everything. That's great that the Kings didn't have air conditioning and we have air conditioning, but like it's cold comfort to me if I feel like I am struggling to keep up with the basics.
Sure. And I think the answer is we need to know if we want our standard of living to continue on an upward trajectory. We need to know what it is that causes that to happen versus what it is that prevents that from happening. And the unfortunate thing is, far too often, the things that we look around and say, well, this change would make my life better, or this alteration in policy will make everybody better. More often than not, those things that appear on the surface to be the right answers end up not being the right answers, and they actually make life worse off. So the reason that we want to look back 1, 2, 3 generations in part is because you've got to go back that far because their trajectory is slow, but it's steady. But you want to see the contrast. What are we doing that's markedly different from what happened back then to cause this change?
A former guest and a friend, Marion Tupy, has this book Superabundance, and he argues that we are experiencing something where, as we have more people, we get even more stuff. It's a kind of accelerating curve of abundance with people. That, with contra to Malthus or to Paul Ehrlich and the environmental movement, who are anti-humanists, and Paul Ehrlich has this horrendous claim that even if we could give the world cheap nuclear power, it would be like giving an idiot child a machine gun. That more people good, more prosperity, and that is it's almost inevitable, or at least it is the path that the planet has been on. How do you understand the way that's happening? Do you agree?
Well, I I think Ehrlich is an interesting thinker. Let me say that. Um, I tend to disagree with most of his proposed solutions, although his observations I certainly do find interesting. I think part of what has happened is we have done this knee-jerk reaction, and Ehrlich talks about nuclear energy, and that's an interesting thing to point to. Nuclear energy becomes a thing in the 1970s, and the environmentalists in this country, all for very good reason, say, stop, we shouldn't do nuclear power because of the following things. Okay. What the environmentalists missed then is they weren't thinking like economists. Economists don't ask the question, what is the ideal solution? They ask, of the alternatives in front of me right now, which one works best? In nuclear power, for all of its problems, and again, the environmentalists were correct about the dangers, those dangers actually ended up being less than the dangers of fossil fuel. And yet today, while we could be operating on entirely nuclear, we could have a 100% carbon-free environment in the United States right now. We don't. Why? It's the environmentalists, largely, from the 1970s we have to blame for that, ironically.
That's interesting, because it's like, the way I understand it is, even with nuclear power, there's still a lot of use cases where electricity isn't the energy component that's actually at play, where there's like heavy industry and stuff like that. So, like, where do you see like the greatest constraints on material progress? Like, where are we butting up against scarcity the most?
That's a good question. I suspect that the United States is butting up hardest against scarcity when it comes to human capital, on two counts. One, our educational systems have been faltering for decades. We know that this was happening in the public school system. We keep spending more and more money, and our results keep getting worse and worse. Now, you can argue, well, the problem is you need to spend ever more. Or you could argue that spending doesn't matter. Whatever the solution is, I'll put that off the table. I will just point to the reality that in terms of outcomes, public education has been declining for decades. And you're now seeing that in higher education. Our university system has become largely, in my opinion, one of fraud. Universities and colleges in this country are doing to students, to parents, the same things that banks did to home buyers back in the 2000s, when we had the housing crisis. What was going on is banks were loaning money to people they knew could not afford to repay it, and everything goes fine until the economy turns down and they lose their jobs, and now they can't afford to repay their mortgages. We have tons of people going bankrupt. So too, colleges and universities are admitting people who they know can't operate at a college level. Not saying because they're stupid. It may be because, and in some cases maybe it is, but in a lot of cases, it's you've got a student whose skill set turns more to the practical rather than the academic. Nothing wrong with that. We need lots of people who could do practical things. Also, you've got a problem that because with the declining public school education, we've got students coming into college who otherwise would be able to survive, but haven't learned how to study independently, how to be a self-directed student. And what are colleges doing? Instead of bringing the students up, they're putting pressure on faculty to pass them. And so the quality in our higher education drops. So one reason we've got a constraint of human capital is our educational system all the way through is deteriorating. The other reason is our population growth is topping out. Population growth in the United States is now basically zero. We're replacing people as they die, and that's about it. Why does that matter? Well, the big advances economically in our standard of living come from relatively few people. I'm talking about the big advances. So you think about a Henry Ford, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, people who are so good at what they do, they not only make themselves and their families and their communities better off, they end up making the whole world better off. Those people are very rare. Let's say they're 1 in 10 million. Okay, with 300 million people, you've got 30 of them, right? Or if you have 100 million people, you have 10 of them. The more population you have, the more people like that you have that are way out on the edges that can make everybody's life better. But with our population topping out, and if indeed it turns around and starts going down, expect in the future to have fewer people like that.
That sounds like some real elite hero worship. So make the case for this, that the outsized output of a handful of people is as great as you're claiming, and as attributable just to those people, uh,
Right.
rather than to broader forces. Um, one there's a book several years ago, the title of which I think was "What Technology Wants," that there is a kind of march of discovery. Something like the light bulb. I think like a lot of inventions were actually discovered by multiple people right around the same time.
Mhm.
I think throughout history, whether it's the engine or like there's a bunch of instances like this.
Sure.
So underpin this case for this exceptional Ubermensch.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not hero worship, and you're absolutely right. It's more than the individual. You need a system in place that rewards out of the box thinking, right? And that's one of the reasons why you see so many of these people coming to the fore in the United States. It's not that Americans are somehow smarter than everybody else. It's that we have a system that by and large rewards you well when you do something that's great for other people and will punish you when you don't. And so, you talk about multiple people coming up with the same invention. Alexander Graham Bell is a good example, right? The word is he invents the telephone along about the same time that somebody else does. He gets the credit for it. The other guy doesn't. If Bell hadn't been there, the other guy would have invented it. Okay. But you need a couple of ingredients. One is, again, you need a large enough population that you've got those really smart people. Doesn't have to be Bell, but it has to be somebody. And you've got to have that person in an environment that rewards that sort of behavior.
The um How do you understand the role that Americans have played in material progress for the past, let's say, couple hundred years, but especially in the past 150, since the, sort of industrial revolution? What's going on here? And like what if you were gonna like make the argument that we are the outsized innovator, what do you point to as examples, or as like maybe aggregate data if you've got it? Maybe you don't have it off the top of your head, like numbers of inventions or Nobel Prize winnings or whatever. Make the case for that.
The case I would make is a market-based case. Largely in this country, we reward people who do well. And when I say that, what I mean is we leave it to the market to figure it out. So you invent some object. If this object makes my life better, truly, in not in some way that some bureaucrat's going to decide, oh yes, Davy's life is better. Let me decide. If I decide that the thing you produced makes my life better, so much so that the thing you produced is worth more to me than the dollars in my pocket, I will voluntarily hand those dollars over in exchange for the object. And you have been rewarded for producing something that has made my life better. generally speaking, in the United States, we have a system in which that kind of thing is possible. Now, if you move into a system where, for example, we think, well, the people who are rich should be paying a lot more than everybody else, we send a signal to you, the entrepreneur. And the signal is, go ahead and take a risk. Invest what you've got, come up with some interesting object that you think people are it's going to make other people better off. And if you're wrong, well, that's on you. You invested your money, you're bankrupt. But if you do well, if you're right, we're going to call you a rich guy that owes something to everybody else, and we're going to tax you at phenomenal rates. To the extent, I'm not saying you can't do that at all. We do it a bit in this country. But the more you do it, the more you take away this guy's incentive to take the risk and to attempt to make other people's lives better off. And I'm not saying that the guy is an altruist and he's looking to make other people's lives better off. That's a beautiful thing about market economics. You can be completely selfish. The only reason you're doing what you're doing is because you want to earn more money. But so long as it's a voluntary interaction, I get to decide that, yes, indeed, your thing made my life better off. Therefore, I'm going to give you the money. Doesn't matter what your motivation is. You end up, in the end, making other people's lives better.
Do you think that that is the case now in of the United States as compared to, let's just limit it to the rest of the West, the Western Europe, Western Europe, the first world Asian countries? Are we still that? Because as I understand it, I think we have the most progressive tax system in the OECD, that we fund our government on the backs of our wealthiest citizens more than places like Denmark. So how does that comport with that?
I don't know how that breaks down the progressivity. I do know that in terms of the total income that Americans earn, our governmental system taxes us less of that than the European systems do. Now, you can make all kinds of arguments about, well, yes, but you get, free health care in Europe. Well, you don't get free health care in Europe. You get prepaid health care through the form of higher taxes, right? So to that extent, I'm not saying that you only get innovation, entrepreneurship in the U.S. Of course, you get it in other developed countries as well. But what you'll see is a gradation. The greater the government's footprint in a country, the less incentive you have for entrepreneurship. There are exceptions, but generally that's the trend.
This seems to be something that there was like a kind of broad consensus around with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Bill Clinton famously said the era of big government is over after, in the late 90s. And that same time frame saw the only instance in modern history of the United States actually running a fiscal surplus at the federal government. It was like the very end of the 90s, tax rates, government spending. We actually were living within our means at the federal level. And then things started to turn. And it seems like that era came to an end. Not just fiscally, but politically, starting with 9/11 and then accelerating with the financial crisis. And now we're in a very strange time. How do you understand the change in belief in capitalism and free enterprise in America?
So I think it's proper to put it in perspective. What happened in the Clinton era, and by the way, Clinton did not have surpluses. He came closer than any modern president. But if you look at the government's debt year to year, it actually went up in every year of Clinton's administration. The reason we say they had surpluses is because of the way in accounting they dealt with money that's being borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
They were counting that as revenue, not borrowing. Yeah, so if you look at the official figures, it looks like we had a surplus. But, give Clinton his due. He came closer and very, very close.
And give Gingrich and the Congress, right?
Sure,
they were the purse strings.
But here's part of what was going on. It was less a matter of fiscal discipline than it was a booming economy. This was the early days of the internet, And all of that technological revolution was really ginning up the economy. And as the economy grew very well, of course, tax revenue grew. And that's what was going on. It wasn't that we'd gotten somehow fiscal discipline, right? All of a sudden we ran to a bunch of money we didn't have before. And what happens every time Congress runs into a bunch of money it didn't have before? Well, next year it figures out how to spend it. On average, I did the number some years ago. I don't know if it still holds, but at the time, if you looked historically, on average, every time the government collected an additional dollar in tax revenue it didn't have before, the following year its spending went up by $1.25, right? So all of the argument about, well, we need to raise taxes because we want to close the deficit, well, every time the Congress gets more money, it just spends it. And that points to what I think is the fundamental problem in this country. If you ask Americans, left, right, center, it doesn't matter. If you ask them, what is our problem? They'll say, well, we're spending too much. We're spending money we don't have. Yet people on the fringes will say, well, we should spend everything. And other
Oh, we
people
can
will say we
just
should spend nothing, right?
MMT,
Yeah.
MMT, print the money and then tax the money we print, and we won't end up in totalitarianism, or maybe we will, and that's what you want all along, isn't it?
Right, yeah. But generally speaking, the broad base of Americans will say, yeah, the problem is we're spending too much money. I'm sure we could find a supermajority of Americans who would agree to that. The problem is when you ask the next question, okay, what should we cut? And now all of a sudden, if you got 100 million American voters, you've got 100 million different answers what we should cut. And we never get consensus on that. And because there's no consensus, politicians individually have an incentive to spend more. Now, if you ask your politician, well, should we be spending more? Oh, no, we should be spending less. Don't you agree with that, Mr. Voter? Oh, absolutely, I agree with that. Except for this particular project that's here down in my neighborhood. I think we should spend money on that. Okay, fine, that's a very small drop in the bucket, but there's 100 million drops in the bucket like that. And before you know it, you're back to spending money we don't have.
What about this 25-year period? Here we are, it's 2025. So we're at the quarter century mark. And I entered like the adult workforce in 2001. So I sort of was starting the work. Along comes the dot-com bust. And pretty soon after, you get this real estate boom that crashes. And it has been this tumultuous time. Some people have, said it was sort of the end of the Great Moderation, this period of sort of low inflation and growth, and the sort of the 80s, 90s, the halcyon time of the 90s. What happened? How do you understand what's happened in America in the past 25 years? Because there is a new coalition that speaks to some extent, in one sense, with one voice, and it's more like one cacophony. And that is, you can kind of see it embodied in President Trump and his sort of motley crew. A concern about the collapse of the middle class. I'm putting that in scare quotes, but I'm not doing that to be dismissive of the claim. A belief that we've become oligarchic, a deep concern for growing inequality and rising cost of living, and that the system's sort of rigged. That has brought together people from the traditional left and the traditional right. You will find people, right-wingers like Tucker Carlson, sounding a lot, in some cases, like Elizabeth Warren, although I think she's one of the most reprehensible people in the Congress. What do you make of that? Because it is a strange new, like, shared voice, shared concern. You could call it populism, but how do you understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play here. One is, to your original question, what changed? I think what changed somewhere around late 90s, early 2000s is American voters got comfortable with deficits. Deficits were the big thing prior to the early 2000s, that you could lose an election if you weren't tough on deficits. Americans were very uncomfortable with that. Somewhere around the early 2000s, we became comfortable with deficits. And once that happened, politicians felt free to spend as much as they want. We're looking now at CBO is projecting $2 trillion plus deficits as far as the eye can see. What that implies then is if you've got a voter base who don't care, despite what they say, they don't care about deficit spending, and you've got a voter base who does not want their taxes raised, well, and they don't want spending cut. So no taxes raised, no spending cut, don't care about deficits. What's going to happen? That's a recipe for the Congress just to spend more and more money they don't have. But how do they pay for it? They borrow. They borrow more and more. And that creates an odd situation that I think we're just bumping into now. And that is the Federal Reserve, since its founding, has had two charges. One, keep the money supply stable, keep prices stable.
Yeah.
Two, ensure full employment. All of a sudden now the Fed has an unspoken third objective, and that is to keep the federal government solvent. Because as interest rates go up, all of a sudden the federal government is owing more money. The way it is now, by the current numbers, a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, just 1%. So we're 10-year treasury rates are like 4% now, go to 5%. 1 percentage point increase in interest rates will cost the federal government $350 billion a year.
Whoa.
That's 25 NASAs just from interest rates going up 1 percentage point. So all of a sudden now the Federal Reserve has this problem that if it allows interest rates to go up, this costs the federal government money that the federal government doesn't have. What's the response? Well, the Fed could monetize some of this spending by basically jacking up the money supply to pay for what the government's spending, but now you're going to get inflation. And I think this is what we're going to be facing moving forward. Right now, economists are scratching their heads wondering, why is it that we can't get inflation back down to where it was prior to COVID? And my argument is you'll never get it back to where it was prior to COVID. The elevated level of inflation is the new normal because the Federal Reserve is having to monetize some of this federal spending. So this is one of the things that feeds into this thing that you've seen. The other thing that feeds into it is the media. Somewhere along the same point, I'd say the late 90s to early 2000s, ceased to be an industry who felt its job it was to deliver news to us. And it became an industry who believes its job it is to deliver opinions to us. And they're looking to keep our eyeballs. And why? Because they sell advertising. So the media has a profit incentive to show to us not the news as a whole, but specifically the pieces of the news that are controversial, that will get our blood flowing, that make us mad, that make us scared.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yes, that's what the media has a profit incentive to show us. And so consequently, we all come away thinking that the world is a much worse place, that these problems you talk about, the inequality and poverty and so forth, are much worse than what they are. And I'm not saying that the media is lying to us. I am saying that they're only showing us part of the truth. And because of that, we come away with a distorted perception of what's going on.
You know, one of the pieces of the puzzle that has caught my attention, this show, it's called Dad Saves America, partly because it began with a concern. And that concern was my son's generation, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha that's coming up after them. They have serious mental health problems, like a very real measurable increase in psychological distress, anxiety, depression, suicidality. And that this is manifesting in a demand for safety and a retrenching from risk taking. Even to things that you could say, like as a parent, you'd be kind of happy with, like kids are having less sex, they're doing less drugs and alcohol. Well, isn't that great? It's like, well, maybe it's great unless it's because they're collapsing inward socially and not interacting with each other and afraid to engage with the world. And so this spawns a bunch of questions for me that from a free market sort of Panglossian classical liberal perspective have been challenging. One of which is, how do we as people that believe in free markets confront the fact that we, the wealthiest, most innovative society in the history of the world, have such miserable kids and a miserable population to the extent we do. And then the other piece of the puzzle, which is related but also separate, is we talk about our unemployment like it's low, and we fail to account for something like 7 million working age males that at the time when the unemployment statistics were designed would have been considered unemployed. If you were 35 years old and didn't have a job, that's unemployment. Like exiting the workforce as a man, I don't know what you're talking about. So if you roll them back in, our unemployment rates look like major recession level, not what they are. So those are these two indicators of something rotten in the state of Denmark. How do you think about those? Have you confronted this? What do you think about that? Because that poses a challenge to me that has
Yeah.
cracked some. Not, it hasn't made me like, therefore government, but it has made me like, maybe some of the concerns aren't just the media scaring us, but there's something else going on.
Yeah. And this is, I don't mean to minimize any of that. Um, I see it as well. This rising mental health issues in kids, and one might be tempted to write it off and to say, well, yes, but we simply diagnose things today that we didn't diagnose 20, 30 years ago, and so it was always there. I don't think it was always there.
Well, and one point counterpoint to the people who say that, because I've asked that exact question to the people like Jonathan Haidt and others, and it's like, well, yeah, but we have suicide attempts, cutting, actual suicide. These are measurable things that have gone up that aren't just, I was miserable, but I kept my mouth shut and nobody diagnosed me. So
Yeah.
I think there's indicators that, and I know you're not trying to dismiss it, but for those who think like, well, maybe it is just, we care a lot more about mental health now. It's like, that's not true.
Yeah, no, I don't think, now, I think that plays a little bit, but I don't think it's the major player here. I My gut reaction is that the major player here is that our lives have become so incredibly, how should I say, wealthy. Um, the median household today, their purchasing power is equivalent to a top 1%er of 1924. Um, we have become so wealthy that in a lot of ways, the hardships that, and you want to take away hardship, particularly from your kids, but there's a good side to hardship. It makes you tough. It makes you realize that here's something that's important. Here's something that I may not like, but in the great scheme of things, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It makes you self-confident that I can take on a challenge because I've been through a lot of them.
Yeah.
That kind of thing seems to be lacking amongst our kids, and it's not their fault. I think we have done what parents everywhere want to do. We've given them safe lives and wealthy lives, but there's this other thing that comes along with it that I don't think, and perhaps it's because we're the first generations that are really unbelievably wealthy in the great scheme of things. We don't have experience with it yet. And so we ended up protecting our kids maybe from things we shouldn't have protected them from. Let them fail a little bit. You talk about kids, they're not engaging in drugs or not engaging in sex. That's a great thing. And every parent wants that. But as an economist, I have to point out that that's risky behavior. And risky behavior comes in two flavors. One is, if you can reduce the risky behavior, you don't have them doing drugs, you don't have them doing sex, but you also don't have them reaching beyond themselves.
Hmm.
You get less of that too. And it may be the case that in trying to mitigate that one type of risk, we forgot about or weren't aware of that we were mitigating the other type as well.
You have 6 kids, is that
Yes,
right?
that's correct.
So what's the age range of your kids?
Well, they're now 30 some to 20 some.
So how has your role, not as a economist, but as a father of 6 now young adults, young to mid adults, how has that shaped your understanding of the American experience and where things are going?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know that it has shaped it, or I should probably say it differently. To the extent that it has shaped it, it's been so ingrained, so subtle. I haven't been aware of it. But I will say this: as a parent and as an economist who's a parent, I always made it, and so too my wife, important to emphasize the linkage of right and responsibility. That if we were going to say to a kid, you can't do X, you do not have the right to do X, it's because you're incapable of dealing with the consequences, of handling the responsibility of X. Or conversely, if they say, I want to do this thing, okay, you want the right to do this thing? Here's the possible downsides. They're all on you. If this happens, you want the right, you get the responsibility goes with it as well. And I think if I were to point to one thing socially that bothers me in the United States is that we have a tendency to separate rights and responsibilities. Everybody wants the right. I want the right to do this and that and the other thing, but the responsibility, oh no, that's somebody else's fault.
Right.
Those two things have got to go together for a healthy person and for a healthy society.
What other ways have you instilled that as an experience for your kids?
Well, what we've attempted to do is to link those two things and explicitly as possible. So, for example, we heated with a wood stove for probably our entire lives, and one of the big tasks every fall was stacking the wood. Right, so the wood comes in, is delivered, and it's a
Wait, you
probably a,
heated your home just with wood?
not just with,
Okay.
but it was a major thing, right?
Okay. Okay.
And
Where do you live?
well,
Are you in the, are you out in the woods? Are you out in
for
the
a while,
woods?
yeah, in West Virginia, the middle of
Okay.
nowhere, West Virginia, where actually you had to have a wood stove,
Yeah.
to southwestern Pennsylvania, where it was an aesthetic thing, but
Yeah.
it was fine. It kept the electrical bill down a little bit, but nonetheless, every fall in comes several truckloads of wood, and there they are, has to be stacked. And so I'll say to the 6 kids, okay, who wants to be boss of the wood? And to be boss of the wood means I'm going to pay you several $100s to stack this wood. If you want to hire any of your siblings, that's between you and them.
This is the
You,
most economist thing ever.
you work out how that happens, right? But
Okay.
from my perspective, if you take on this job, you get the right, I'm going to pay you X $100, but it's also responsibility. So if you contract with sibling X and sibling X doesn't pull his weight, you don't come back to me and say it's not stacked because of this. No. My deal is with you. You want the right to the money, you got the responsibility that the job being done or not done is on you and you alone. So you can kind of tell in part we heated with wood at the end because it made an interesting object lesson.
Oh, that's great. Oh my God, what a great idea. What other tips? I mean, having 6 kids today is a pretty unique position to be in. What other um tips and tricks did you learn? Because one of the things I've noticed is even going from I only have one, and my sister has two, and going from one to two is immediately like a step function change. But
Right.
once you go to six, was there like a point where, okay, past three,
Oh,
we've already
yes.
been doing zone defense, and the marginal increased complexity keeps going down with more kids? Tell me
Oh,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah. There's a tipping point somewhere around 3 to 4 where the more kids you have, the easier it is because they occupy each other and take the pressure off of you.
Did you consider an economist with 6 kids reality show at any point?
No, but that's beautiful. That's a beautiful idea. But I could tell you, one of the things, drawing on the economics, one of the things that kind of put its foot down and said 6 is it was the vehicle. You could get at a reasonable price a vehicle to seat 8 people, so 2 parents, 6 kids.
Yeah.
But to have one more kid, you've got to go up to a vehicle that seats 15. There is no vehicle that seats 9 or 10. It's 15
Yeah.
or it's 8.
Yeah.
So at that point, you said, all right, that's enough.
Are we going to drive a 15-pass van to the store every day?
Right, yeah.
One of the things, again, coming back to the state of affairs now, we have, as you've already said, low fertility. Like, people are not having kids. Not enough to grow our population if it's just native born. I've heard some people, and I haven't dug into this very much, that actually housing affordability is perhaps an important, like, non-trivial component of the shrinking American household.
Yeah,
How do you understand what's going on there?
yes and no. Here's the thing. I mean, absolutely, housing prices have gone up, and rising interest rates aren't helping because you'd get a mortgage and all of that stuff. So yes, indeed, that's all on the table. But that's a short run thing. That is, this has become a serious problem in the past 5 to 10 years. And my guess is in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll cease to be a serious problem or be a much less problem than it is now. It's a short run thing. What's important in my mind is to look at the long run thing. And the long run thing is this: you could have today a house that is eminently affordable if you're willing to give up all of the things that we now take for granted in a house. So it's relatively recently, and by relatively recently, I mean the past 2, maybe 3 generations, that houses have indoor plumbing, electricity, HVAC, they're wired for internet, all of this stuff that we take for granted in houses. I mean, it's just standard. Of course, you don't have a house that doesn't have that. Well, yeah,
No
but
HVAC.
yeah,
What kind of barbaric talk is this?
exactly. But here's the thing. If you go back 50 years, a house like that, a millionaire couldn't afford that. We're literally living in a place where the middle class is in houses that 50 years ago only millionaires would be in, if that. And add to it the fact that today the median house is twice the square footage of the median house 50 years ago. So you've got twice as much house just in size. And the median household in terms of number of people is half what it was 50 years ago. So on a per person basis, you got 4 times the square footage in your house. So right off the bat, my argument is, why would you be surprised that the price of housing is this? It's simply keeping pace with the magnitude of the housing that we're living in.
This is and I know that you're you've left academia, God bless you, to join the true
I saw the light.
the true private sector. You're no longer in the fraud business, so good on you for that. And maybe we'll come back to talking about academia a little bit. But I want to focus on this housing question more, because in a lot of the people I've talked to, even younger people that work for me in our office, like older Gen Z, young adults, people in their 20s, many of them really believe they will never be able to afford a house in America. They are looking at the landscape and saying, the kind of life that, it's like an okay boomer economics, the kind of life that you have been able to build, that I have as a Gen Xer, and get on the train of housing, that's now cut off. They don't have access to it. The minimum entry point is so high that it will take so long to save a down payment that it's just never going to happen. They're never going to catch up. So has there not been a divergence between incomes and housing costs? How do you understand the
Yeah.
relationship there?
Yeah, there has certainly been a divergence. So again, I'm not saying that housing hasn't become, particularly in the past 5 years,
Yeah.
markedly expensive. Um, but there are other factors at play that don't negate that, but do moderate it. For example, one of the things that people will tend to do, young people, is to say, well, look, you've got this house. How can I possibly afford that? Okay, but what you're doing is you're looking at my house that I could afford after 40 years of working and saving. Of course you can't afford that right now. I wouldn't expect you to.
Yeah.
You know,
I lived
now,
in an apartment
yeah,
first.
come back in 40 years and let's have a conversation. So that's one thing that's going on. I think the other thing that's going on is this tendency to forget where these people who are living in the nicer houses, where they started. So when we first had kids, we're living above a garage apartment. right? And we had no air conditioning. Um, we didn't go out to eat, because it was too expensive. There was no Starbucks coffee. There was no computer, this kind of thing. All of the things that people take today for granted. And maybe they're little things. You've got a cell phone and cell phone service, and that runs you whatever, $50 a month. Well, that's not much. It's $50 a month. Okay, but you stop at Starbucks every day. That's $3 every time. Okay, but it's only $3. But you add up all of those things and you multiply them by the number of days in a month, and all of a sudden you find people saying, I can't afford your house, but I want to afford it and not give up any of these interesting things that I have. Okay, but those of us who have houses like that gave up lots of interesting things in order to afford the house. Now, again, I don't want to hit too hard on young people, but I do want to underline that part of, and it may not be the number one, but it is a significant part of what is going on, is they're making a false comparison of where they are now to where their parents are now versus where their parents were 40 years ago, and comparing, wanting to save for a house and maintain their current lifestyle as opposed to cutting back on their current lifestyle and building up for a house.
One of the things that, and you've written books on statistics, and you know that statistics is something fundamentally difficult for, I think, humans in general. But my grandfather used to say statistics make liars and liars make statistics. And there's a certain kind of truism to that. Um, when we hear that the median or the when we hear that the median or the average American lives like X, how how have you looked at what's below the surface of that? Because if Bill Gates walks in the room, the median income transforms very, very fundamentally in a way that no longer tells anything about the way everyone but Bill Gates lives. He lifts the median, right? So or am I getting that wrong?
He lifts the average.
He lifts the
Yeah.
average. So that's the mean.
Yeah.
But
No,
I'm getting stats
No,
wrong.
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
I'm getting stats wrong right from the gate. But my point is, there's an intuitive sense of things, and I think a lot of what's going on in our lives is that we have these intuitions about inequality, about what's happening in our society relative to the past and relative to what's right and wrong, and then along comes the rational optimist to say everything's going better than it's ever gone before, and it doesn't land. So help build that out for me.
Yeah. So first off, going back to median, yeah. So Gates walks in the room, the average goes up, the median doesn't. The median is the guy in the middle, and you raise a very important point, which is any time you're looking at numbers like we're describing right now, you should be careful to look at the median. You want to look at the guy in the middle, not the average. And the numbers I've been quoting to you are all coming from median figures.
For the person so can you just expand on those definitions so that our viewers understand what median versus average really means?
Sure.
Like we're in we're in your class.
Very simply, there's three of us in the room. My income is 0, yours is 50,000, and his is 10 million. The average income in the room is 9 million something. But that doesn't really tell us anything about the people in the room. I'm 0, you're 50,000, he's 10 million. The median is not the average. It's rather, take the guy in the middle. You're the guy in the middle. The median for this room is 50,000. Now that shows much more clearly what's going on in the room.
And how does that work when we look at the US population? There's 340 some million people of different ages, and how do we know what the median is for these different things?
Yeah,
how does that all work?
And that's where we can thank the US government. The Census Bureau maintains these figures, so they do a tremendous amount of work in surveying Americans and finding out all kinds of detail. How many people are in your household? How much does your household earn? Where do you live? How much are you paying for things? So all of this data is available, volumes of it, but it comes from the Census Bureau. So we can know this. Now, do we know it absolutely exactly? No, but we know it within a small enough margin of error that we can say that we know it.
The one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle in this story of our culture is, and it's been adopted more broadly than just the left. This, you go back to like the Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. That was a chant of the progressive left. I think that has now become an ethos that's also on a lot of parts of the sort of conservative, the MAGA right, populist right, whatever you want to say. Um, what has happened with inequality in this country? Do you have a good handle on that?
Yeah, yeah. Inequality is interesting. On the one hand, you get this thing about, well, we are the 99%. No, we aren't. America is virtually all of us, not all of us, but almost all of us are the 1%. You only get the 99% if you restrict your vision to the United States. If you look at the planet, we're pretty much a country of all 1%ers. And what happens here is when we talk about inequality, we tend only to look in one direction. We look up to people who have more than us. We rarely look down to the oceans of humanity who have less. Give you an example. $7.25 an hour, not even 10, $7.25 an hour. Full-time job, 2,000, whatever that is, 2,080 hours a year. $7.25 an hour is about $15,000 a year. Take that $15,000 and adjust it for differences in cost of living. So it's cheaper to live in Mexico, so it means more. It's more expensive to live in Switzerland, it means less. Take that $15,000 a year, adjust it for differences in cost of living, and what you find is that the median, the guy in the middle on planet Earth, is earning less than that. Quite literally, what we call poverty, the rest of the world calls middle class. That's how ungodly rich we have become. And yet, when we talk about inequality, we don't look at the people who have less. We only look at the guys who have more. We say, look at how much Bill Gates have. I should have that as well. And so, in part, we have an observation problem. You might even call it an envy problem, that people who complain about inequality, not all of them, but a lot of them, really, if you drill down, it's envy, it's not inequality.
I just want to take your stuff because I want it.
Right, because I want it. Right.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind about inequality is we have this tendency to think that it's static. So people will say, well, whatever the number is, 10% of us were in the lower, I guess 10% of us are in the lower 10%, right? 10% of us were living in poverty or whatever it is, and 50 years later, still 10% of us living in poverty, we haven't done anything. And these are sorts of things that people will say. And I give you an analogy. Suppose you graduate high school, and as you graduate high school, it's a 4-year high school, so you look around at the other students, and 25% of them are freshmen, 25% are sophomores, juniors, seniors. You graduate, you leave, and you come back for your 30th anniversary reunion, and you look at the high school, and 25% of the students are still freshmen, 25 are sophomores, 25, and you conclude that nobody ever graduates from this high school. Well, of course, it's ridiculous, right? It's a different 25%. Everybody's graduated. But that's how we tend to look at inequality. We see in 1 year, this chunk of Americans are in the bottom 20%. And we move along 50 years and we look, and it's the same size of Americans are in the bottom 20%. Yeah, but it's a different group of people. Think about an individual. You graduate college or high school, whatever it is, you're a poor guy, right? You're earning nothing, and you work your way up. And as you work your way up, you now become a richer guy. Some of us become very rich. If you look at the distribution of Americans from year to year, it looks like it's the same number who are small, rich, and middle class, when in fact each of us are moving through those stages.
How much of that is a function of age? You make less money when you're fresh out of college, or certainly fresh out of high school, than you're making when you're in your 40s and then in your 50s before you start to maybe head towards a retirement age. And how much of that is a function of other kinds of mobility?
Well, I think a lot of it is not a function of age, although age is kind of a proxy. It's a function of the value you bring to an employer. So when an employer looks at you, the employer sees someone who can generate money for the company. And so the employer is going to naturally say, okay, how much can you generate for me versus how much I have to pay you to get you on board? And the more experience you have, the more education, the more skill, the more the employer perceives that you can bring to the company, and so the more he's going to be willing to pay you. So I think age is kind of a proxy for that, but it's really those three things: skill, education, and experience that are driving that.
The one of the things that I've heard, I had a guest on the show that's a sort of a good proxy for um the disenfranchised young conservative men, to come back to this sort of cohort. And he articulates a view that I've encountered quite a bit, a sense that it is hard to get on the first rung of the ladder,
Yep.
in a way that feels different and worse, and whether it actually is different or worse than when I was their age in my 20s or you were. It is a very broad-based feeling going on out there, that this story, that this notion that we are so much wealthier than the rest of the world. It's like, I don't care about what's happening in Bangladesh or India, or whether we're richer than them. I care about what's happening in America, and I can't make it. I don't see a path forward, and I see it only getting harder for me as a 25-year-old young man who's struggling to figure things out and trying to get those first opportunities. You know, uh, what is your answer to them who hears this and it just um doesn't come through? That comparison to the rest of the world, I don't care about that. There's always going to be horrible poverty all around the world. Even if
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. But let's just say that we, you, the young man, and I have agreed that when you say inequality, you actually mean envy. That you don't want to look down at people who have less. That doesn't matter. But all of a sudden, people have more. Well, that does matter. Okay.
well, but Anthony, to push on this, uh well, I don't get to have any say in the way these other people in the rest of the world are governed, or the rules of the road they're driving on. But I'm concerned about the inequality in my country, because this is the game I was born in to play. These are the rules of the road for us.
Okay.
And so I care about us.
So
I get to vote for our president. I don't get to vote for the president of India or China.
Gotcha, 100%. So what you mean is, you live in a society where it is possible for you, through the government, to take from that guy who has more than you, and it's not possible for the people in Bangladesh to take from you because they live in a different country. And we're back to the envy thing.
Is that fair? Is that a fair depiction?
Sure, the people in Bangladesh cannot take anything out of your pocket, but you can take something out of the rich guy's pocket. So consequently, you don't have to care about people in Bangladesh. You only have to care about this guy who has more than you.
One of the things I was excited to talk to you about and dive in this way is that the mental health crisis we were talking about earlier has, I think, presents a deeper challenge to classical liberalism than most classical liberals I know take it as.
Mhm.
You know, there's a kind of solutionism in this movement of ours that we are a part of.
Oh, yes.
A kind of like, graph goes up and to the right, good. And our main job is to point out how people's concerns need to be put in contexts like this. And it's an academic kind of context. And so my challenge back again is, if be more charitable. You're saying, okay, me, the young man who cares, whose only scope of influence, however nominal it is with my vote, is the U.S. and our rules of the road. And sure, we've inherited. I was only born 20 years ago, and so I was born into a country that's super wealthy, and I've been told a lot of stories about why that is. Some of them are that it's parasitic and exploitation, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not. I don't know, but I know that I'm trying to live my life the best way I can, and it seems pretty hard.
Sure.
And I can only thank or blame my country, my city, my family, the stuff here. I'm an American. I don't care about these other people.
Okay.
Because
that's fair.
And it's not envy. It's not envy. I don't want to take from them. I don't want them to, it's like I'm just not thinking about it.
Fair enough. Then I think as the ground rule, we'd say, okay, let's put inequality aside because that's not the problem. That's not what's bugging you. What's bugging you is that you want to get ahead. You yourself want to get ahead. And there are barriers in front of you. What kind of barriers are there? I would argue there are at least two. One is, with all good intention, we have set up a system that penalizes you for work, or prevents you from working in the first place. So, for example, with a 15-hour minimum wage, the push for 15 or whatever it is, we think that what that does is raise up people who are earning less than 15 to earn more, when in fact it doesn't. It's not lifting up the people to a higher rung on the ladder. It's lifting up the ladder, and it ends up being out of their reach, because an employer is going to look at you and ask the question, is this guy's labor worth 15 an hour? Now, if you're a young guy, you're just starting off, you don't have the education, experience, training, your labor is not worth 15. If we require the employer to pay you 15, his response is going to be, all right, well, I'm just not going to hire him. And what happens? Now you've lost an opportunity to get the experience, the skills that would have moved you up.
I've seen one example that seems very connected to this, even though the minimum wage, depending on where you live, has remained relatively low and I guess, shrunk in real terms with inflation. But the amount of young people in high school taking summer jobs has declined dramatically in
Yes.
America in the past several decades. Like, it's really notable how much youth employment, which is often where you develop some pretty useful skills for just how to
And you
show
don't,
up on time, how to,
just showing up on time, right? to speak well, to dress well, appropriately for the job, all of that stuff. And these are things you're not born knowing that. You figure it out, and you figure it out by being thrown into a job, and you're not going to get thrown to the job if the employer is required to pay $15 an hour. So that's one thing that's going on. And to go back to your point about the mental health, one of the things I don't think we value enough is that when the kid gets that first job, even if it's paying a pittance, the kid comes away not just with the experience and with some skills, but also with the sense that I can do this. I may not be earning millions of dollars out there, but I can earn something. And I saw myself how I got skills and how I'm now worth more than I was before. And I can build on that. And you give the kid a sense of fulfillment, a sense of hope, a sense of self-control that he wouldn't have otherwise. That all
agency.
feeds, agency. That all feeds to, does it solve the mental health problem? I don't know, probably not, but it's a big step in the right direction, I think. But this is one thing that's, go back to your question of what's standing in people's way. One thing is that, with all good intention, hoping to make lives better for lower income people, we've inadvertently moved the ladder out of their reach. The other problem that the young person is facing, and this applies to young people who would have a tendency to go to college, is college has become inordinately expensive.
Yes.
So expensive that in a lot of cases, you actually end up spending more over the course of your career for the education than what the education is worth. What has led to that, in large part, not in totality, but in large part, what has led to that is our well-meaning intention to make college affordable. And so what we did was we institute subsidized loans and government grants. And what happens every time we do that, we say to students, to colleges, we're going to help these students pay for college. Here's $1,000 to every student going to college from a Pell Grant. What happens? The universities then raise tuition by $1,000. They absorb that. When we subsidize the loans, and so now students are getting a lower interest rates, they're more likely to take out loans. We make it easier for them to take out loans. What do colleges do? They hire loan officers who will help you work through the loan process. And in the background, we're jacking up the tuition so that we can capture, we the universities can capture some of that low interest money that the government's providing for you.
One of the things that I had an aha moment about not that long ago was that there's this term that I've kind of forgot because it's been a while since I've been in college. Financial aid.
Right? Yes.
Go to the financial aid office. Financial aid sounds like a grant or a gift or support, but it's not. It's all loans.
No,
It's
it's
all
the financing. It's that guy when you buy a car. After you're done with the salesman, they send you off to the other room where you deal with the financing. That's what financial aid is at a college. It's financing.
um the the mechanism there of pouring more money into a thing, into an industry, into a sector, and having it not um create a larger market with more competition, but just be captured and capitalized and extracted by the existing players. Help me understand that more because I think when somebody hears every instance of the government's going to make something cheaper, it's almost always that. It's almost always we're going to cut you a check to help offset the rising cost of the thing. Why is that different than other kinds of market activities, like where we see prices, real prices come down, like in electronics, or is it,
Yeah.
why is it that um that demand doesn't produce other responses that bring the cost per student down?
It's because what causes prices to go down in any market, or I should say, one of the things that causes prices to go down in any market, is the ability of the consumer to walk away, to say, I don't want your product, I'm going over here. And the harder you make it for the consumer to walk away, the more ability the seller has to raise that price. And so when we come to education, what happens? Well, one of the things that happens is we build this infrastructure of accreditation combined with student loans, and we restrict. You can only get your institution's students can only get student loans if it's accredited. And who's the accrediting body? It's the universities themselves.
Is
And
that the
they
way it works right now?
Oh, yes, it's the way it works. And so they have an incentive to say, oh, here's an upstart bunch of entrepreneurs who've come up with a low-cost university. Oh, no, no, we're not going to accredit you. And because we don't accredit you, you can't get access to student loans. And now all of a sudden, the financial aid people are saying, oh, come here, we can give you $100,000 for your education. No, they're not giving you $100,000. It's coming from the government. You're going to pay it back. Meanwhile, the people over there who are unaccredited, they say, well, we'll give you a degree. And you say, well, what do I do with this degree when I'm done? You can't go to graduate school because universities for masters, for PhD, will only accept degrees from accredited institutions. Our universities have built a guild in which they've restricted the number of producers. They're not allowing entrepreneurs in, and consequently, someone who's looking for an education has fewer options. They can't walk away as easily as they would otherwise. And so that's part of what helps to keep this price up.
The um being reminded now, there is a new university in Austin where we were in DC today, but we're normally, we're based in Austin, the University of Austin, UATX.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember now the hurdles and the time. They couldn't even call themselves a university until they got their accreditation.
Yes.
And it took years to get the accreditation, and the accreditation was only at best provisional.
Yes. And let me give you some inside baseball, because you think, well, a school should be accredited. It guarantees it has a good education. No, that's not what's required for accreditation. What's required for accreditation is you have to have a physical library with a certain number of books. So immediately, if you're an entrepreneur, you say, well, we're going to do low-cost education. Everything's going to be, it's all PDFs. Oh, no. You have to build a library. It has to have physical volumes, certain amount of them.
Huh?
You have to have on staff good teachers? No, but you must have PhDs. A certain fraction of your faculty have to have PhDs. Do they have to demonstrate that they're good teachers? No. They have to demonstrate they're good researchers? No. You just have to show they have PhDs. Why? Well, because it's expensive. It's hard to get PhDs. And so it makes it harder for you, the upstart university, to compete with us.
This all makes me so very angry.
Yes, and you see now why I left the damn thing.
It does seem like so many things are there is this sort of demonic nexus at in academia. Let's stay with this. Okay.
Let me make you matter still.
Please.
What's going on in academia today? We've reached what we've known was coming for a long time. They call it the demographic cliff, where this steady increase in number of college-age students tops off and then starts to decline. So now colleges are having to, they're finding these problems that there just simply aren't enough students to keep the colleges going. And so what's happening is colleges are admitting students who they shouldn't be admitting. And you see the evidence of this. A number of colleges that say, oh, we're no longer requiring the SAT. And they'll give you all kinds of reasons. Well, the SAT is racist or the SAT is discriminatory or whatever it is. No. They're not requiring the SAT because they don't want it on paper anywhere of the low quality of student they're allowing in. And again, I don't mean anything derogatory toward the student. I'm simply saying that colleges are attracting people that they would not have gone after before, not because they think that they can educate these students, but because they want to get hold of the government money that's coming through them, the taxpayer money of these subsidized loans. Now, it gets worse. What happens when a student who isn't well prepared for college ends up there? Well, you go through a college course and you fail. You fail because you haven't tried, or you don't have good study habits, or you don't have a good background in this subject, whatever it is. In the past, and by in the past I mean up until about 30 years ago, you failed. That's it. You're out of the university and somebody else will come along. Now, deans put pressure on faculty to pass the students. If your failure rate, the number of students you fail, is too high, forget about failing. Even if the number of C's you give is too high, the dean will come looking for you. What happened here? There's something wrong with you as a teacher that you're giving. Not that there's something wrong with people that we're admitting people we shouldn't be admitting. There's something wrong with you as a teacher, and so we're going to put pressure on you. And if you're untenured, the pressure is well, they'll just fire you and replace you with somebody who's going to pass students. If you're a tenured faculty, it's a little bit better, but not much. All of a sudden, opportunities for you will dry up. There'll be subtle pressure on you from various things all the way through. You don't get a raise to we're going to put your office down in the basement to we're going to give you bad times for your classes, whatever it is. But we're going to put pressure on you so that you pass students. Because when you pass students, that keeps them in the seats. And as long as they're in the seats, there's money coming into the university. It has become literally fraud.
So this combination of declining demographics, which the universities are obviously tracking and forecasting. I haven't heard this actually. So I don't know how I haven't heard about
And
this.
let me put a big footnote here, because I just saw going through my head that clip being repeated over and over again. That it's fraud.
I completely agree that the university is a fraud.
There are very good colleges in this country, so don't put them all in the same bucket. However, the trend is in this direction that I have described.
Well, okay, so I want to try to process this for a second, because the story that we have been hearing culturally, and especially those of us that are like on classical liberal conservative on the right broadly, is you have all this DEI ideology that has created racial quotas and all kinds of non-merit, non-capability nonsense. But what I'm hearing is something kind of darker, which is that yes, there's a bunch of commies and it's all left-wing gobbledygook in university. But then below the surface, there's just this scam where we're going to run out of customers. So let's put up all these signs about DEI and belonging and like, nothing to see here, no song and dance here. Where it's just we just want to get bodies in seats so we can get taxpayer money and just keep on building buildings and paying ourselves $400,000 a year, et cetera, like Elizabeth Warren, who's making $400K to teach like 2 classes and write bunk papers on bankruptcy. Is that what's going on? That's
Yeah, I can't say anything one way or the other about DEI initiatives or any of that. I simply don't know.
But they conveniently tell a story that allows you to create a real to bring people in under that guise that isn't about whether you have the academic chops to be matched with the school. And one of the things I know that came out of the Harvard lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court is, and Thomas Sowell has talked about this, and many others, is that it isn't fair to a student to come in and not be matched with the rigor of the school. Because as I understand it, our mutual friend, Brian Kaplan's written about this. You only, to the extent you get an economic benefit from going to college, a large portion of that is contingent on you finishing and getting your degree. And if you come in and don't get the degree because you can't cut it, you get like the worst of all worlds. You get the saddling of the debt and expense, the waste of your time, and you get none of the benefit. There's no capital. There's no human capital formation. You just got suckered in to buying a house you couldn't afford.
Right.
And got foreclosed on.
Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Right.
Here's some debt that, by the way, will survive bankruptcy.
Right. Yeah. And let me moderate a little bit here. And quite honestly, I think there are students for a wide variety of reasons who are behind the 8 ball. They're students who would do well in college except for, and list whatever it is, their background, their home life, the school that they went to high school in, whatever it is. And
having to work 3 jobs.
Yeah, all sorts of things. And colleges have learning programs within them in which there aren't the coursework. This is a separate thing to help get these students up to speed. And I think there are a lot of students who come in behind the 8 ball who really helped by that. But here's the problem, and it goes back to our earlier discussion of rights and responsibilities. To give you the right to this extra help to bring you along, that's fine, but you've got the responsibility that at some point you've got to mainstream. You've got to be able to hold yourself up. If colleges did this, they provided this extra help for students who needed it for the first year, a little bit for the second year, and by the third year, you're on your own.
Training wheels,
but training, and you got to take them off because you got to fly on your own. That would be great, but they don't. Instead, you get the training wheels all 4 years. I would have situations with senior students who are about to graduate college having to get extra time on a test because they're within this group of the training thing. They still have the training wheels on. And I'm looking at these students, and it's not their fault. It's the institution's fault that we haven't taught them to fly. I'm mixing metaphors, to fly without the training wheels, right? We haven't taught them to ride without the training wheels. And I'm looking at them thinking, okay, this feels good now. You're going to get through my course. You're going to, pass the test because you've got the training wheels, but then you're going to step out the door and the employer doesn't have training wheels for you. And we have failed you. We have taught you to be reliant on this right without the commensurate responsibility of learning how to do without it.
I remember when I was teaching my son to swim. He was maybe 5 or 6, and we're in the shallow end of the pool, and he's kind of going along, but I'm looking under the water, and I see him tapping his foot on the bottom. And we were doing it for a while, and it wasn't the first day of doing this, but my experiment was, I'm going to throw him in the deep end. So I was right there, not going to let my son drown, but I threw him in the deep end. It's like, all right, Matteo, you can do this. Threw him in the deep end. And he's there. And he's like, Papa, help, Papa. I'm like, I'm right here. You're going to be fine. You're safe. And he's doing it and he's doing it. And he sort of doggy paddled his way to the edge. And it was like a step function change almost immediately.
Yep. Yep.
There's something in human nature that when you know you have a safety net, you behave differently. You take your foot off the gas, something happens. I've experienced this myself all the time, frankly. It's uncomfortable because we want to have safety nets, but it's a moral hazard.
Yeah.
It creates moral hazard. It gives you the ability to be lazy.
It gives you the ability to be lazy. You never learn to do on your own. And it goes back to the mental health issue. And that's got to reflect in your mental health, that somewhere in the back of your mind, whether you know it consciously or not, you have this feeling that you aren't capable of taking care of yourself.
As a small, limited government free marketeer, how do you think about safety nets in general? And yes, government and Social Security and whatnot, but more like as an economist, because even without, I think, a classical liberal argument against the welfare state is private enterprise, mutual aid societies, churches, and communities have in the past provided this sort of help to keep you from slipping through the cracks. They actually still provide it today. You see an ocean of organizations that help people who slip through the state cracks. Not perfectly, but how do you think as an economist about what does a healthy safety net look like, in the simplest terms, like even at the level of being a parent, because I've spoken to a lot of parents whose kids who are often into adulthood suffer from substance abuse, and in many cases they have to cut their kids off. And it's like this painful realization, but it's like, I can't keep being the safety net for my son or daughter who I love because I am enabling them. I am creating dependency. And that's got nothing to do with government. That's just human incentives. How do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a term in psychology, the devouring mother. I'm sure you could substitute devouring father as well, but you're taking such good care of them that you actually destroy them.
Yeah.
Because they never stand on their
You
own.
just atrophy.
Right, yeah, they atrophy. And I think, going to your question, in the ideal world as an economist, I would see the safety net, if you want to call it that, being private charity. And private charity in this country handles a tremendous amount where the poor are concerned. Mutual aid societies, which we put out of business. People aren't aware of mutual aid societies. They're private organizations that you would join as an individual, and the organization would provide unemployment insurance, health insurance, life insurance, this sort of thing. They disappeared when Social Security came along because Social Security basically put them out of business. But that sort of thing is the primary safety net. Now, it's not perfect because it's a market tool, and markets are comprised of humans, and humans are imperfect. So there are going to be people who fall through the cracks there. That's where you get a government safety net. The government safety net should be the safety net of last resort, not the safety net of first resort, which is what we make it. So I would then do away entirely with Social Security, let it all be privatized, do entirely away with unemployment insurance, let it all be privatized, but have this other thing at the bottom for people who fall through the cracks. Because there are some people, think about people who are born severely mentally challenged.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, their family should take care of them. Okay, fine, if the family does. What if there is no family? Or what if the family's negligent? Who who's at the bottom, grabbing the people who fall through the cracks. And I think that's a good place for government. And to my brothers and sisters who are free marketers and are appalled at what I just said,
I mean, you did kill off most of the welfare states, so they shouldn't be that appalled.
let me point back to our founding document, in which we claim that all people are created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. That is, the rights that we have, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, so forth, are not granted by government. They are inherent in the fact that we're human beings. They're inalienable. If indeed we have inalienable rights, then I suggest, because right and responsibility goes together, we also have inalienable responsibilities. And the inalienable responsibility is to take care of those who are less fortunate. Absolutely, market should be the first thing we use. But if they don't work, then we should have government.
I want to push into this a little bit because I broadly agree with everything you just said, but let's strip the government away for a second. Even within private charities, you can see the creation of dependency. I've done a bunch of work with other organizations around homelessness, and there is a lot. Now, you could say, well, a lot of these organizations are sort of government funded, so they've got sort of weird incentives. But there's definitely a diversity of approaches to helping people who need help. And is there a rule of thumb or a way of thinking economically about how to provide help that could help a private charity avoid becoming a private source of dependency?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's okay that I don't, because the market works it out. And by that, what I mean is, if we've got a charity over here that is creating the dependency you describe, and it's a private charity, it depends on donations from people, voluntary donations. If it is creating the problem you described, then people like you and I who care about this problem will see what this charity is doing and say, no, we don't donate there anymore. You donate over here. These people are trying it differently. They don't create dependency. And so the market will work this out. Now, is the market perfect? No. We're going to have bad charities like you describe. In the long run, they'll get weeded out. What if they don't? What if people like you and me who donate to the charities don't pay attention? Yeah, these guys have a flashy ad campaign. I'll give them my money.
It's principal agent problem in a certain sense.
What happens when we, the donors, aren't responsive to what the charity is doing? We just blindly give them money, and the charity continues and it does horrible things, making people dependent. Then we have a problem. But the problem I suggest is not a market problem. The market's simply a tool. The problem is us. That you and I, as donors, have got to get our heads on straight, that we really don't care about the people. If we did, we would pay attention to what's going on.
Well, this is one of these things that over time, as I've thought, I'd say it's really since like around 2007, 8 with Ron Paul that I got turned on to classical liberal thinking, people like Mises and Hayek, and this world of free market thought. And one of the things I've found evolving for myself is seeing freedom as an end, and freedom understood as a means, which is to say, yes, there is a certain amount to some extent, we as human beings want to be free, and by free I mean make choices, have choices, not be told what to do. Just knowing that I have choices gives me a certain amount of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
But freedom itself, you talk about rights and responsibilities, how we use our freedom, what our freedom is for, strikes me as a place where the economist style of thinking tends to punt. Like,
so?
In the sense that I'm not saying economists don't care about this, but the rank order of preferences, what we care about is like a black box. It's only once you are taking action and you're deciding what in the world of scarce resources that's when economists step in and say, okay, here's how the incentives will work, and here's how marginal productivity works over here, and diminishing returns happens over there. But this 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 sense of guidance towards the good, or towards what will make why I should want freedom in the first place. It comes back to the psychology. Like, I want my freedom for a reason. And I feel like our movement, our leaders, people, haven't always been all that good at that, at articulating that, or at helping with that. And it maybe if I can
Oh,
opine for a little bit,
no, I'm with you.
react to that before, because I've got a second piece to this, but I want to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts in
I think
response.
the key there, because I've gone down this same path you're describing. The key there is to realize that the the desire for freedom is not fundamentally a desire for freedom, it's a desire for equality. That if we are truly equal, then I cannot make decisions for you because I don't have priority over you, nor can you make decisions for me. And the consequence is what we call freedom, but it's really a deep love of equality.
That's a really interesting way to think about that. I haven't really heard that formulated that way. That the desire for freedom is really a desire for equality, or maybe equal dignity.
Yes, equality in the sense that the founders meant it, that we're equal in human dignity.
One of the pieces of the puzzle here that this points to, that I've been grappling with, and it very much stems out of my paternal nature, is the movement towards freedom, towards economic freedom, towards liberty, towards individualism, has in large part, I think, been shaped by a vision of the alternative being 1984, authoritarianism, communism, top-down planning. And something that we've been talking about, including like when you talk about the level of wealth, of comfort, of lack of things that stress us in ways that every human prior to now have been stressed almost entirely, like inescapably.
Mm.
Is that maybe the problem that we face in the 21st century isn't 1984, but it's Brave New World. And what I mean by that is, as I understand, in that story, we get lulled into passivity. We get comfortable with opiates, like literally. And in our case, opiates and video games and detachment and isolation. And it is a behavioral and psychological collapse that is a different kind of tyranny than guys with mustaches.
It's bread and circuses.
Yeah, there's some, and it is striking to me that feels like a more pressing threat, for even though we just went through, we had COVID, which was basically like communism 2.0. Old school communist horrible stuff is always there, but how do you think about that? How do you think about
Yeah.
this challenge to, broadly speaking, liberalism, or classical liberalism, openness, freedom, markets, material progress?
Yeah, and this is the problem. If you believe in equality and consequently freedom, which leads you to free markets and free choice, you're left with the uncomfortable conclusion that people are going to make decisions that may not be good for themselves. And one of the things that has happened, a good friend of mine says, you get the government you deserve. I think what's happening is we're getting the government we deserve because too many of us have used our free will, have chosen to be disengaged. I'm happy. I've got, the Netflix and my phone and food in the refrigerator. And, this guy's on about tariffs. I don't know what this is, but I'm going to watch the sitcoms or whatever. We have chosen to be disengaged. from our political system. And in so doing, we've created a power vacuum that's being filled by people who have figured out how to co-opt the political system to their own advantage. We're getting the government we deserve.
I think what I want to push on is whether or not there's something maybe more, I don't want to say more profound, but more rooted in the human animal and its limitations than that, which is to say, we are by and large the same creature we've been for a very, very long time. And we have the same 24-hour day. We have the certain amount of calories that and nutrients that we need to be healthy. And so when we haven't changed all that much. And yet, you know, we might be approaching something like a kind of almost post-scarcity world. And you look at AI and robotics, and those two things coming together in ways that seem to be moving very quickly towards something like, oh, wow, I think in my lifetime, I will be able to buy a robot for not that much money
Hmm.
that can do just about everything, including talk to it like a person with the complete corpus of human knowledge. And it'll be able to do the physical things that we used to think would be hard for robots, like get under my sink and stuff.
Right.
That's turning out to maybe not be so hard after all, or we're breaking through some of that. That's going to open up this other frontier that the like Homo sapien animal is going to need to adapt to in ways that might be hard.
Oh, I agree with you. Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's any good government answer, but it feels like we're starting to creak under some of that. And I don't know how to think about it, but I'm just curious, like, how do you think about that? Your kids are young enough. They're going to be, their
Yeah.
lives are going to be, their careers are probably going to be upended in profound ways, as will mine and certainly my son's.
Well, but we're already well into the environment you're describing.
Yeah.
I mean, stop and think about it. For decades now, in this country, we have had, and I don't know what the number is, but I'm sure it's over a million Americans living decent, not opulent by any means, but decent lifestyles. They have food, they have clothing, they have shelter, and yet they aren't producing anything. Now, go back 100, 200 years. If you weren't producing anything, you died. You starved.
Yeah.
That's the way it's always been. And I don't mean that in a heartless sense. I mean that it's simply the case. If you couldn't grow enough food to feed yourself and your family, you and your family died. It's just the laws of physics. For the first time, we're at the place where we can support millions of human beings who aren't producing anything. And I don't take anything away from human beings. I'm just marveling at our level of opulence. We can do that. Now, what you're describing is not something new. It's just that moved forward. That imagine that we're in a place where we can support hundreds of millions of people who aren't producing anything. That's the environment you're describing. What happens then? One of two things. Either you free human beings to be creative. I can now be the artist I always wanted to be because I don't have to worry about a 9-to-5 job and earning money and fixing the car and all that stuff. You create entrepreneurs who come up with new ideas. You unleash the creative side of humans. That's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is there'll be a bunch of humans who maybe aren't blessed with the creative side, or alternatively, because I think we're all creative in some sense, are more interested in watching videos of cats and what's on Netflix than
Or any
or
number of
whatever it
things.
is, and they deteriorate. What happens then? I don't know the answer to that other than run that forward over the course of 100 years, and I think you end up with a new type of human being, a human being who, unlike our ancestors who first, came out of the caves and the thing you had to do was be strong. If you could lift this thing and run after that thing, you survived. And then you move forward, and it wasn't the human beings who were strong, but the human beings who were skilled. and I can cut stone or wood in a certain way. And you run forward a few hundred years, and it's not the human beings who are skilled, but the human beings who can think of intelligent things. And now we're going to the next phase, where the thing about humans isn't being strong or skilled or technically savvy, but it's being creative. I think we unleash a new thing in humans.
The 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 best I've been able to come up with on this so far for my like in because I feel like I have a freshman son, so he's right here. He's in his second semester of his freshman year of college, and he's in a space where it's cheap enough that whatever the fraud is tolerable.
Right.
Like we've worked it out so far that I'm not spending 60. I'm not buying a car every year in cost. It's a cheap car. Um, and maybe he'll finish, maybe he won't. I don't know. We'll see. Um, I've come to feel like one of the most important things he can be doing is developing a sense of discernment,
Hmm.
of fundamentally of moral discernment. What does it mean to and whether he will embrace this or not, but I think he has to some extent. Uh, this is actually the pursuit. Like maybe our new pursuit is the old pursuit, which is,
We're going to be philosophers.
well, to some, or at
Yeah.
least like that. Even if you're not going to be a philosopher, maybe you're going to be if I wasn't doing this, I'd do construction. Like that's my favorite thing. I like building stuff, but knowing what a human is, knowing like the good, the true, and the beautiful, having a moral life. For me, I'm Catholic. This is a part of my life that's growing over time. I think partly in response to the world I'm seeing around me. Um, those are the age-old questions, like why are we here? What is life
Mhm.
for? And to some extent, we are both sounding a lot like Karl Marx, as he as he opines on the post-scarcity world, are we not?
Oh.
Oh, capitalism will produce such plenty that it will give rise to a life in which you are an artist and a poet and a philosopher, and a new man will emerge. Did he maybe get this right in the long run? Are we all going to end up being like, there was that middle point with the mustache guys murdering everyone, but then eventually Marx kind of turned out to be kind of right? Is that possible?
Sure, I think it is. Now, I think he's wrong in the way he thought it would come about and that it had to be engineered by smart people. But the end game, I think, comes that way. And if you follow the progression of humans from, our animal roots up till now, everything points in that direction. I think the transition and how we got here and how we go the next steps are a lot easier and a lot more pleasant than what Marx had in mind. But in a lot of ways, yeah, I think maybe we end up at the same place.
Have you thought about that before?
No, I hadn't. This is very interesting. You're the first person that has ever put me in the same bucket as Karl Marx, so I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time.
I mean, he's kind of like a boil-covered satanic nightmare in a lot of ways, but there are some parts of his writing that are interesting. Alienation from work and this.
Yeah, and I think the thing to underline here with Marx, and you approached him correctly. He's a philosopher. Where the world goes off the rails is in thinking he's an economist,
Right.
which is probably in line with thinking that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were biologists. You'll go off the same rails there.
The what do you think about? I'm gonna do a hard turn. Uh, what do you think in a brass tacks way about what we're seeing right now with the Trump administration? Because he's a very interesting character. I personally voted for him. He's not my favorite guy in the entire world, but with some enthusiasm. As a classical liberal, as I believe in free trade. I'm in favor of way more immigration than Donald Trump has professed, or certainly his supporters broadly support. Uh, but even so, for all kinds of reasons, I was like, I kind of like, I'm in. And I'm curious. And so far, I don't know what to make of it. It's moving real fast. But like the amount of like spotlight on spending, we were talking about this a little before we started rolling. There's a bunch of stuff that, frankly, from a libertarian perspective, I would think is broadly like 2 thumbs up. How do you think about what's going on?
Yeah, I started off, particularly in his first run against Clinton, thinking that Trump was a crazy person. And I pretty much, not to say that I thought the Democrats were fielding anybody that was any better, but I kind of maintained my opinion that Trump was a crazy person until recently. And it occurred to me, it's possible that he's actually brilliant. And I don't know where I fall yet. But what I do is point out the fact that in coming in while he was still president-elect and talking about all these tariffs, and I said outright to anybody who would listen, this is complete stupidity. It is impossible to raise tariffs enough to replace the income tax, which is one of the things he was talking about. And regardless, even before you ever get there, you've destroyed a large portion of the economy because free trade is far better. This is, I hate to use the term settled science, but in economics, it really is. Economists of all stripes will tell you that, generally speaking, we're better off with free trade than with restricted trade. And yet, is it possible? I don't know, but is it possible he was using that as a political cudgel that he never intended, or maybe he intended something much less? But the point was that he was looking to get foreign governments to lower their trade barriers. I don't know. What I do know is that he has done something, whether intentional, whether by accident, I do not know, but he has done something I never thought I would see. Not only did he not increase government spending, he cut government spending. And I don't mean he talked about cutting government spending. He is currently, as we speak, laying off huge swaths of government employees. Is it legal? I don't know. Will it survive court challenge? I don't know. Is it because he's brilliant? I don't know. What I do know is it's something that I never expected in my lifetime to see, and it's the right direction. Is he doing it for the right reasons? I don't know, but it's the right direction. To cut the size of the federal government is the only way to solve our fiscal problems.
One of the things that I think is interesting about him, and I think about trying to even get your head around him and people like him and the moment we're in, is from a free market type mindset perspective, there is this like piece of the puzzle that tends to be lacking in our discourse, and that is leadership. Like, we're, even my organization, which I named Emergent Order. The order will emerge, or even more passively, spontaneous order. It will just like pop into reality. And we talk about entrepreneurship as a process in the abstract. And I think that has sometimes left our team like not with not a lot of language for what it means to try to lead in the real world, and the weird mix of like characteristics necessary for different types of leadership in different contexts. How do you think about that? How do you have you thought much about like, leadership even through an economic lens, but the nature of it, the nature of the kind of person. You mentioned early in our conversation, these the Wright brothers, the Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, this enormously outside Steve Jobs, who I personally love, and my audience is always like, "You're crazy. That guy was an asshole."
Yeah, how many of them have iPhones? Come on.
Like,
I
why
mean,
do
he
you
may
love this?
have been, but
I've done several instances of videos where I've talked about my adoration for Steve Jobs, and every time people are like, "He was just a lefty jerk. He was so mean. What's wrong with you? I'm losing respect for you." But there's something strange, which is like those people you're mentioning very often are like jerks. They're like crazy. The reason why they can punch through the world of the now and be like, everyone's telling me no, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway, is because they're built in such a way that puts them at odds with the norms of civil society, which Trump is very much one of these types of people.
yeah,
How do you think about that?
yeah, and we're back to, we had touched on this much earlier, of the two ends of the distribution, and I think that's what you've got here, is the same type of person who exhibits these properties. They think outside the box, they're charismatic, people follow them, they've got great ideas, they're willing to kick whatever in the teeth and to push forward. Those types of people are, on the one end of the distribution, the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musks, the Henry Fords, maybe Donald Trump, I do not know, because on the other end, they're also the Adolf Hitlers. Maybe the Trump, I do not know, but it's the same qualities in both sides that can be employed for good or ill. Um, that's as much as I know. Now, how do you determine at the outset, here's somebody with these attributes? Is he the good guy or the bad guy? Sometimes it's hard to tell.
I think one of the things that is hard from a civics perspective in this moment we're in right now is that we have a kind, and I don't know how to, I'm not quite sure how to say this. There's something like a childish civics that we will hear trotted out from a lot of quarters, including our own, about the rule of law. And what I mean by that is, okay, like you mentioned, he's like, they're literally taking, as we sit here, they're taking USAID off the building. I think, as I understand it, I think that agency was created by an act of Congress, so the executive branch maybe isn't legally, constitutionally able to just shut it down.
Well, okay,
Or something.
but time out. We can't cherry pick when it comes to this. You could say, well, Congress established USAID constitutionally, the executive can't shut it down. Okay, but according to a strict reading of the Constitution, Congress was never supposed to set it up in the first place. It's not one of the delineated powers.
Well, right. So this is one of the things, and some of our friends in like Liberty Land get irked about this. And this is, I think, where there's divides on the right about Trump and his strategies or antics, depending on how you look at it, which is, it doesn't seem to me like if you're if you are concerned about shrinking the state and returning to the public, to individuals, more rights, more ability to keep more of our money, that working within the kind of inherited body of mangled, monstrous agency norms works. Like, if you want to play by the rules of the norms of this town, we're in Washington, D.C., that all sucks.
Yeah, but you now tread in very, very dangerous territory. Trump is doing all of this stuff, shutting down all parts of the federal government. If he makes the argument that he's actually operating within constitutional boundaries, because you read the Constitution, it does not authorize the federal government to do these various things. In fact, reading the Constitution does not lay out what the government's not allowed to do. It lays out what it is allowed to do.
Yeah.
If it's not listed there, it's assumed the federal government does not have that power. So
That's the enumerated powers.
the enumerated powers. If President Trump invokes an argument like that he actually is acting within the boundaries of the Constitution, I think we're much safer. If instead he says, look, this needed to be done, everybody knows it needed to be done, and so I'm kicking politics in the teeth, I'm kicking the law in the teeth, and I'm doing it. Be really careful cheering for that, because the next guy who comes along who's of a socialist variety and is going to say this, use the same words and say, I'm now establishing the people's society of X to decide what everybody's going to study, what colleges are going to go to because it's for the good of the economy. I'm kicking the politics and law in the teeth to do it. Whoever comes after Trump is going to use the same arguments he used.
I understand this argument very well. I think it's a sound concern. I think the interesting question, the challenge to this is why I was saying there's a kind of use of the notion of rule of law that gets a little like, do you just not want anything really to change? Is that we're already there. It feels like. I know there are constraints.
Oh, I think we've been coming to this point for over 100 years.
Yeah.
It started back in the 1910s, 1920s in this country, and we don't notice it because it happened a little bit at a time. A little bit at a time, we started treating the Constitution more as a set of recommendations rather than a bulwark around the government.
Yeah, I mean, I think of to go back to that time, is it Filburn? There was the case during the Depression in which
Wickard v. Filburn?
yes, I love this one because it is as totalitarian as I can imagine. We have the Commerce Clause, which says that the U.S. federal government shall regulate interstate commerce. Interstate commerce. And what does regulate even mean is an open question. To make regular, which would be to just let it happen and avoid interstate tariffs, that was probably what they meant, not to control it. But here you have a man growing wheat in his own plot of land solely for his own consumption during a depression. And the FDR administration goes after him, and its justification is by making wheat, you don't need to buy wheat, which you might buy from somebody in another state. Therefore, we get to shut you down.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court says thumbs up to that argument.
Yep.
And so this is the part of, and I'm not like the most MAGA guy in the world, and I don't want a new king. But I've lost a little love for pretending our rule of law is something that it's not.
Mm.
And I'm curious how you think about why we haven't gone off the rails even more than we have in a world where we already have a government that has decided that it can tell us that we can't grow food on our own property.
I think we have gone off the rails in a very big way. We just don't notice it because it's happened so slowly. We started off this whole conversation with my pointing out that we have not realized how ungodly wealthy we've become because it's happened over multiple generations. I think as well, we don't realize how far off the rails we have gone because it has happened over multiple generations. You said, you don't want to live under a king. I would argue we already do. It's the Supreme Court, starting with somewhere around that Wickard v. Filburn decision, where in effect the Supreme Court said the Constitution says whatever we say it says. Well, from that point forward, your king is nine-headed.
It's as you look ahead, as a man with 6 kids, you have a lot of skin in the game for the future.
Literally.
Literally. I know you are very much a rational optimist. You see the world moving in a good direction, and I think it is, broadly speaking, clearly true. How do you think about the future beyond, let's say, our potentially inevitable post-work, post-scarcity Marxist utopia?
The world.
Let's assume that's a little far off. Like, where do you sit right now, looking ahead?
I think the world is is a great place and it's going to become even better, with a few hiccups along the way. But remember this, markets, the economy, politics, government are all tools. They're tools that humans have devised to work their way through the problems that we encounter. Fundamentally, I believe humans are good. And because of that, we'll end up in a good place. We're going to make mistakes as we go. We're going to get setbacks. There are going to be people come along who aren't that good. But fundamentally speaking, humans are good. In the long run, good is going to win out, and we're going to end up in a beautiful place. And for evidence, I point to where we have come over the past 200,000 years.
What's your definition of good?
Humans are made as co-creators. We participate in creation. And sometimes, and particularly at the beginning, that participation was as simple as turning that animal into food, turning that tree into shelter. Now creation has become writing music, constructing, communicating, debating ideas, writing poetry, writing books. I think humans are fundamentally good. And one of the pieces of evidence I would point to is as we move forward, as the world becomes better, we become better, more refined, more interesting creators.
Do you believe in God?
Absolutely.
How do you think about the role of faith in your own conception of this, of the world, of its nature, of our economic activity?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think people sometimes get faith wrong. Faith is not a belief that God exists. Faith begins with the assumption that God exists. Faith is the belief that the universe is unfolding the way it should. I believe it is. Can you point to examples in which it isn't? Yeah, absolutely. Generally speaking, I think it is. I think I can point to more examples than someone else could point to counterexamples. But ultimately, it's faith. That is, if you push me to the wall, I cannot prove it. If I could, it wouldn't be faith.
There seems to be, and this is maybe one of the signs of real optimism for me. There seems to be a resurgence in the turn towards faith, including among Gen Z. I was talking to Jesse, who's off camera here, who's not among them, by the way, but that's okay. I'll get you eventually, Jesse. That like peers are coming back to church, and I do wonder if maybe that's going to be this really interesting surprise of the next phase. I kind of alluded to it, but this wasn't how I was thinking about it when I said, like, thinking about morality as a tool for life in an uncertain world. But it does seem like it's at least possible that this quest, like man's search for meaning, will turn to the ultimate search for meaning.
Oh, I think so. I think it's inevitable because you can't, if if you if indeed God exists, then the deeper you delve into the question of what is the nature of the universe, what is the nature of humans, the closer you will get to the answer or to the existence of God, if indeed God exists. And now I believe God does exist, so I believe, go for it. Make your deepest possible counter argument, find the best counter evidence you can for God. Argue against him as strongly as you can, because the deeper you go, the more I believe that you will find that you're wrong.
How do you think about the role of? Are you a Christian?
Yes.
How do you think about the role of faith and of Christianity, though it's not exclusively so, um, in sort of the evolution of this notion of human equality? How
Yeah,
important do you think that
I
is?
to me, it's very important. Now, I have good friends who are avowed atheists who hold sacrosanct, as I do, this concept of equality. So I'm not saying that faith is a necessary condition for believing deeply in equality.
They might be cultural free riders.
Well, I think it answers. I think a belief in God, or let me say it differently. I think God answers why equality is necessary, or at least it answers it for me. An atheist may have a different answer, and you don't have to be a Christian here. I have good friends who deeply agree for the same reasons and point to the same God who aren't Christian.
Mhm.
It's the belief. It's the belief that there's something out there that we're striving toward. Um, and that something is a should I use the word the something is not a unalive thing. It's an I have no word to use here.
Yeah.
Is it an entity? Is it a person? Is it a consciousness? It's something that's more than a rock that's out there that we're tending toward, that we share something in.
It's
Our
purposeful.
nature is similar to that in some way. Now, the Christian will say, and probably other faith bases as well, will say that the thing that we share is this co-creativeness. This is the creator that created the universe, and we in turn get to create our portion of the universe.
There is something, one of the pieces of that always strikes me as being uniquely true and just hard to justify else otherwise, is the joy that we experience in being creative. And creative takes many, many forms. I think it's accessible to every human being. But that's weird. Like, it's
Yes,
weird that we like it.
yes.
It's understandable why we might do it from some evolutionary argument that, oh, well, we survived in groups and selfish gene. But like pretty quickly that turns into like really low resolution hand waving. I don't know why we love it. I don't know why we marvel at the creation of others. Why do we find the Sistine Chapel to be magnificent? I haven't really heard a good, credible explanation for that,
Mm.
other than that there's something in our nature.
Yes, it touches on our nature, right? Yeah, that's the best that I can do there. You're asking an economist a deeply theological and philosophical question that I'm completely unprepared to answer.
How did you approach, you know, how did you approach, your 6 kids in this process? Because it's like, it's very interesting, uh, how, especially as an economist who's set up internal incentive systems to transmit something like faith and a religious practice. How
I,
did you and your wife do that?
I think the only way you can do it is the way that we attempted to do it was by example. You can't you you don't get anywhere forcing somebody to go to church. At best, they'll go through the motions. Um, and frankly, there's no point in that. You should, and I'm not even saying you need to go to church, but your expression of faith, how you respond to the divine, has to come from within. It has to be. It's part of why we have free will, so that we can respond freely to the divine. And so, we provide example. Everything from as what I would consider as mundane as go to church on Sunday to things that are profound as, driving home from work and there's a guy panhandling on the side of the road. It's a dead of winter. Give him as I got for my Christmas gift. They were beautiful gloves. It hurt so hard. It was good that it hurt so hard. And my son, who was a little kid at the time, happened to be in the car with me. I didn't do it so that he could see me do it. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But lo and behold, 25 years later, he says to me, do you remember this instance? And I'd forgotten it till he mentioned it. He said that it really had an effect on me. Thank you for that.
The you wrote a piece about why we should
Have
really
more
have
kids?
more kids.
I'm so glad you read that piece. I love it.
And I think it's a great place to sort of head towards the on ramp of this wonderful conversation. You have six, which makes you an outlier. You are a hardcore economist. You're a man of faith. You have six kids. Make the case why having kids is a good idea in a world where, for all sorts of reasons, some of which are total horseshit, our 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 younger generation is turning its back on this idea because the climate's going to be something or blah 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 thing that is based on nothing, um but fear. They've been propagandized, or um less nefarious reasons, just like the challenges with finding a mate in a world of swiping and all this other stuff. I know I sound entirely like an old man. I'm totally fine with that. I have a gray beard for a reason. Make the case.
For having kids,
Yes.
good Lord. I I think at the end, for me, and that's all I can say is for me, it boils down to, um, children are wonderful. They're little packets of energy, and they love. Not because they have to, it's just their nature. If you want to see humanity at its finest, in all the terms we've been talking about, creativity, growth, love, kindness, look at a child. Better yet, have one.
Why have six? Have six.
Because it's 6 times as good as having just one. But seriously, they start to interact, they do things, and you see a side of them that you would not have seen otherwise, that you don't see. I mean, you get a little bit of it when you dump them in with their friends in school and all of that business, but it's something different to see a sibling bond and sibling bonds associating, to the point that, and with kids you could start to see this, as you put sets of them together, their behaviors change because their relationships are different, and you see a different side of them just by putting X with Y instead of with Z. You see something in X that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
How much do you think some of the things that are happening sociologically that we've talked about, whether it's the sort of safetyism, fragility, or the mental health, is actually an outgrowth of the shrinking American family? I mean, when I think about what forces in your life toughen you up, man, your siblings are probably the first ones.
Oh yeah, they're the first people to tell you you're full of shit. I mean, to this day, my sister, right? I'm however old I am. My sister will call me up and tell me I'm full of shit, right? And I'll listen to her. PhDs I won't listen to. Right?
For good reason.
Yeah, so there's that. And I've got so happy about that example, I forgot your question.
Well, just like this does seem like there might be a bit of a feedback loop here.
Oh,
that we need to
yeah,
we need to
but
do something to abort and change course on, because it is a self-fulfilling
well, you
prophecy.
talked about risk and how much is our ambivalence toward risk due to the fact that we don't have siblings. You may indeed be right there, but it occurs to me it may also work in the other direction. That as we become more sheltered and more risk averse, our tendency is not to have kids. Having kids it's a hugely risky proposition. I mean, you think about things like, the finances, and of course that's risky enough, but then it's all kinds of things like, is my kid going to grow up to be an axe murderer, right? Am I going to be one of his victims, right?
They have parents.
Right.
It's possible.
Are they going to, decide to go with their friends and start throwing rocks off the side of a freeway because it's fun, because they're young kids and that's the kind of thing, without knowing the ramifications and the risk that puts on me. And this starts all of this at the point of birth. This, my wife is going through the birthing process, and I'm wondering, what are the risks to her, what type of kid comes out at the end, all of this, and all the way through till they finally leave the house, and you think, thank God, I can stop worrying about this. Then they start having kids, and you're worried about that, right? So it may be the case that there's a feedback loop, that our sense of risk averseness causes us to have fewer kids, but having fewer siblings then somehow exacerbates that.
How old were you when you had your first? Do you remember?
27.
I think that might be the actual like average or median age of the first. I was roughly the same. My dad was 23 when I was born, and there's something really interesting about as we are age, like as that number moves up, that's probably also playing a role
Yeah,
because you
I'm sure
get
that
more
does.
comfortable, and kids are going to move more of your cheese, and obviously there's the biology factor, the fertility side of that. Um, I asked this question of every guest. We call the show Dad Saves America partly because I think, fundamentally, because I think that's the role we play, the creative role we play, the heroic role we play as men, if you're lucky, that is just utterly transformative. It transformed me. Um, I get to play this role in my son's life where then he gets to go out, God willing, outlive me and impact the world. And it radiates outward to the whole country. How do you think about your role? And consider this broadly, not just as an economist. In the American story.
My role in the American story. I hope, let me answer it a little bit differently. I hope that when I'm gone, through videos like the one we're making now, through my podcast, through my writings, that I'll continue to cause people to stop and think about things. Um, Maybe think about choices that they make or that are made for them by their government. Um, and hopefully to think about how well off we have become, to be thankful for that, and to respond to the responsibility that entails, which is to preserve our country, our way of life for the people who come after us.
Antony Davies, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you.